No announcement was made. No meeting was held. No one gathered to decide that everyday life was about to change. And yet, at some point in the ancient world, value became something you could carry in your hand. Once that happened, almost everything else followed. People still traded. They still worked. They still trusted and distrusted one another as they always had. But beneath those familiar actions, the logic of daily life began to shift. Exchange became simpler. Relationships became looser. Authority became quieter and far more present. By the time anyone noticed, the change was already complete. Welcome to the history of the world, where we explain how power rises, how systems endure, and how empires fall. To understand what coinage changed, we first need to understand how people lived before it existed. Not in theory, but in practice. For most of human history, there was no such thing as a universally recognized unit of value. Trade still happened, but it was personal, negotiated, and deeply local. In early Mesopotamia, Egypt, and across the ancient Near East, exchange relied on a mixture of barter, obligation, and long-term credit. Farmers did not sell grain for a fixed price. They delivered it to temples or palaces as part of a shared system of storage and redistribution. Craftsmen were not paid wages, as we understand them. They were supported, housed, and provisioned within networks of reciprocity. Silver existed, but it was not money in the modern sense. It was measured by weight, shekels, and talents, not counted. Each transaction required trust in scales, purity, and the people involved. Value was not abstract. It was relational. You needed to know who you were dealing with, how reliable they were, and what they owed you in return. This system worked remarkably well, as long as communities remained small and relationships endured. Credit mattered more than cash. Reputation mattered more than speed. Most exchanges were embedded in social life. To trade was to negotiate not just price, but standing. At the time, this seemed natural. It was. But beneath the surface, there were limits. Long-distance trade required layers of trust. Armies could not be provisioned easily without existing relationships. States found it difficult to extract resources quickly or consistently. Authority depended on cooperation more than command. Then, sometime in the 7th century before the Common Era, in a region called Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, something subtle appeared. Small pieces of metal, stamped with an official mark, began circulating. They were made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. Their value was not negotiated, it was declared. This was not a convenience, it was a transformation. For the first time, value became standardized. Weight, purity, and worth were guaranteed not by personal agreement, but by authority. You no longer needed to trust the person you were trading with. You needed to trust the stamp. That shift was quiet and irreversible. Coins did not spread because people demanded them. They spread because states found them useful. Soldiers could be paid quickly and uniformly. Taxes could be levied without negotiation. Markets could expand beyond personal networks. Exchange became faster, more flexible, and more impersonal. What changed was not just trade, but behavior. Once value could be counted rather than weighed, life began to reorganize around measurement. Time became something that could be paid for. Labor became something that could be priced. Obligations that had once been social became contractual. A transaction no longer implied a relationship. It implied completion. This did not feel like loss. It felt like freedom. Greek city-states adopted coinage rapidly. Soldiers were paid in silver drachmas. Citizens could participate in markets without long-standing ties. Civic life expanded alongside commerce. The same abstraction that enabled democracy also enabled taxation. Participation and extraction grew together. Coins carried more than value. They carried images, faces of rulers, symbols of cities, gods and emblems stamped into metal, circulating hand to hand. Authority no longer needed to announce itself. It was already present in every exchange. People did not experience this as control. They experienced it as normality. By the time Rome adopted and expanded coinage, the system was mature. The denarius paid soldiers, funded roads, and connected distant provinces into a single economic space. Taxes were assessed in standard units. Markets operated daily. Economic life accelerated, and with acceleration came distance. Transactions became anonymous. Trust shifted from people to systems. Belief moved from relationships to institutions. The abstraction worked because people accepted it, and because it made life easier. But beneath the surface, something else had changed. Value no longer required memory. Obligation no longer required familiarity. Exchange no longer required community. The coin did not just simplify trade, it simplified society. At the time, this seemed like progress. It was. But progress has consequences that rarely announce themselves. Once coins became ordinary, they began to exercise power in ways few people consciously noticed. Every coin carried a promise. It said that this piece of metal would be accepted tomorrow and the day after by people you had never met. That promise did not come from gold or silver themselves. It came from belief. Belief that the authority behind the stamp would continue to exist, continue to enforce its claims, and continue to matter. As long as that belief held, the system worked with remarkable efficiency. States understood this quickly, even if they did not articulate it in theory. In the Greek world, coinage allowed city-states to reorganize civic life. Soldiers were no longer dependent on plunder or aristocratic patrons. They were paid wages. Jurors received compensation for participation. Public service could be standardized and scheduled. The same abstraction that enabled broader political participation also enabled systematic taxation. Civic equality and fiscal extraction advanced together, quietly reinforcing one another. This mattered for everyday people. A farmer could sell produce at market to strangers. A craftsman could be paid without entering long-term obligation. Mobility increased. So did detachment. Economic life became less embedded in personal relationships and more dependent on shared acceptance of value. Trust shifted away from people and towards symbols. Rome expanded this logic to an unprecedented scale. As the Republic transformed into an empire, coinage became a core instrument of coordination. The denarius was not merely currency, it was infrastructure. It allowed legions to be stationed permanently far from Italy. It enabled regular taxation across provinces that had little in common culturally. It made economic integration possible without cultural integration. A Roman governor did not need to persuade a community to accept imperial authority. He needed to ensure the coin supply arrived. Coins also carried messages. Early Republican imagery emphasized collective symbols. Under the emperors, faces replaced ideals. Titles, divine associations, military victories all circulated silently in daily transactions. Most Romans would never see the emperor in person. They saw him in their hands, in their wages, in their taxes. Authority became familiar without becoming intimate. At the time, this seemed efficient. It was, but abstraction creates dependency. When systems scale beyond personal trust, they require maintenance that cannot fail quietly. Rome learned this slowly. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, pressures mounted. Military expenses increased as borders stretched, and threats multiplied. Political instability accelerated. Emperors rose and fell rapidly, often violently. Each transition strained confidence in continuity. To meet obligations, the state adjusted the coinage. Silver content declined gradually. The coins still bore imperial imagery. They still claimed the same denomination. The system relied on continuity of belief rather than material consistency. This decision made sense within the logic of the system. It preserved circulation. It avoided immediate rupture. At first, people accepted it, but prices began to drift. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Merchants adjusted quietly. The abstraction remained, but its anchor weakened. Over time, trust eroded unevenly. Some regions clung to old values, others adapted quickly. Barter returned in areas where coin confidence faltered. Payment in kind re-emerged for taxes and military supply. The system did not collapse in a single moment. It fragmented. Rome responded not by abandoning coinage, but by reinforcing it. New denominations were introduced. Reforms attempted to restore credibility. Under Diocletian, price controls were imposed. The effort to preserve abstraction intensified. Authority insisted on value rather than assuming it. This was not failure, it was strain. Eventually, late Roman and early medieval economies became more localized. Coins continued to exist, but they circulated unevenly. Trust became regional again. Value remained abstract in theory, but personal in practice. The system adapted downward rather than disappearing. This pattern repeated across history. In medieval Europe, coinage was limited and inconsistent. Kings minted coins, but acceptance varied. Local trust mattered. Credit was personal. Economic life slowed. When coinage expanded again in the later Middle Ages, it did so alongside growing states, bureaucracies, and legal systems capable of sustaining abstraction. Every time coinage expanded, everyday life changed with it. Work became measurable, time became countable, obligation became optional, exchange became final rather than ongoing. Communities loosened, mobility increased, authority extended itself through symbols rather than presence. Coins did not create empires alone, but empires relied on them. The deeper transformation was psychological. Before coinage, value was remembered. After coinage, it was assumed. That shift altered how people understood fairness, effort, and worth. A task had a price. A life had a cost. Everything became comparable. At the time, this seemed like progress. It was. But progress trades intimacy for scale. It replaces memory with mechanism. It allows societies to grow beyond human limits and removes the need to know one another. When belief in abstraction holds, the system feels natural. When it weakens, people do not abandon it immediately. They adapt around it. They supplement it. They remember older forms of trust. Coins did not disappear. They changed meaning. The lesson is not that coinage failed. It is that abstraction always depends on belief. Systems built on standardized value can endure for centuries. They can reshape daily life so thoroughly that alternatives become unthinkable. But they are never self-sustaining. They require confidence, continuity, and restraint. Once value becomes abstract, societies rarely reverse the process deliberately. They wait for pressure to force adjustment. No announcement was made, no debate was held. Life simply adapted, again. The past is quiet, but it's never done speaking. Subscribe to History of the World, because understanding how it worked is the first step to understanding where we are.